The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 16. The Suprarational Ultimate of Life. For this growing collectivist or cooperative tendency embodies the second instinct of the vital or practical being in man. It shows itself first in the family ideal, by which the individual subordinates himself and finds his vital satisfaction and practical account, not in his own predominant individuality, but in the life of a larger vital ego. This ideal played a great part in the old aristocratic views of life. It was there in the ancient India idea of the Kula and the Kula Dharma, and in later India it was at the root of the joint family system, which made the strong economic base of medieval Hinduism. It has taken its grossest Vaishya form in the ideal of the British domestic Philistine, the idea of the human individual born here to follow a trade or profession, to marry and procreate a family, to earn his living, to succeed reasonably, if not to amass an efficient or ostentatious wealth, to enjoy for a space and then die, thus having done the whole business for which he came into the body, and performed all his essential duty in life. For this, apparently, was the end unto which man, with all his divine possibilities, was born. But whatever form it may take, however this grossness may be refined or toned down, whatever ethical or religious conceptions may be superadded, always the family is an essentially practical, vitalistic, and economic creation. It is simply a larger vital ego, a more complex vital organism that takes up the individual and englobes him in a more effective, competitive, and cooperative life unit. The family, like the individual, accepts and uses society for its field and means of continuance, of vital satisfaction and well-being, of aggrandizement and enjoyment. But this life unit also, this multiple ego, can be induced by the cooperative instinct in life to subordinate its egoism to the claims of the society, and trained even to sacrifice itself at need on the communal altar. For the society is only a still larger, vital, competitive, and cooperative ego that takes up both the individual and the family into a more complex organism and uses them for the collective satisfaction of its vital needs, claims, interests, aggrandizement, well-being, enjoyment. The individual and family consent to this exploitation for the same reason that induced the individual to take on himself the yoke of the family, because they find their account in this wider, vital life, and have the instinct in it of their own larger growth, security, and satisfaction. The society, still more than the family, is essentially economic in its aims and in its very nature. That accounts for the predominantly economic and materialistic character of modern ideas of socialism, for these ideas are the full rationalistic flowering of this instinct of collective life. But since the society is one competitive unit among many of its kind, and since its first relations with the others are always potentially hostile, even at the best competitive and not cooperative, and have to be organized in that view, a political character is necessarily added to the social life, even predominates for a time over the economic, and we have the nation or state. If we give their due value to these fundamental characteristics and motives of collective existence, it will seem natural enough that the development of the collective and cooperative idea of society should have culminated in a huge, often a monstrous overgrowth of the vitalistic, economic, and political ideal of life, society, and civilization. What account are the higher parts of man's being, those finer powers in him that more openly tend to the growth of his divine nature, to make with this vital instinct or with its gigantic modern developments? Obviously, their first impulse must be to take hold of them and dominate and transform all this crude life into their own image. But when they discover that here is a power apart, as persistent as themselves, that it seeks a satisfaction per se, and accepts their impress to a certain extent, but not altogether, and, as it were, unwillingly, partially, unsatisfactorily, what then? We often find that ethics, and religion especially, when they find themselves in a constant conflict with the vital instincts, the dynamic life power in man, proceed to an attitude of almost complete hostility, and seek to damn them in idea and repress them in fact. To the vital instinct for wealth and well-being, they oppose the idea of a chill and austere poverty. To the vital instinct for pleasure, the ideal not only of self-denial, but of absolute mortification. To the vital instinct for health and ease, the ascetic's contempt, disgust, and neglect of the body. To the vital instinct for incessant action and creation, the ideal of calm and inaction, passivity, contemplation. To the vital instinct for power, expansion, domination, rule, conquest, the ideal of humility, self-abasement, submission, meek harmlessness, docility in suffering. To the vital instinct of sex, on which depends the continuance of the species, the ideal of an unreproductive chastity and celibacy, to the social and family instinct, the antisocial ideal of the ascetic, the monk, the solitary, the world-shunning saint. Commencing with discipline and subordination, they proceed to complete mortification, which means, when translated, the putting to death of the vital instincts, and declare that life itself is an illusion to be shed from the soul, or a kingdom of the flesh, the world, and the devil. Accepting thus the claim of the unenlightened and undisciplined life itself, that it is not, was never meant to be, can never become the kingdom of God, a high manifestation of the Spirit. Up to a certain point, this recoil has its uses, and may easily even, by tapasya, by the law of energy increasing through compression, develop for a time a new vigor in the life of the society, as happened in India in the early Buddhist centuries. But beyond a certain point, it tends not really to kill, for that is impossible, but to discourage, along with the vital instincts, the indispensable life energy of which they are the play, and renders them in the end inert, feeble, narrow, unelastic, incapable of energetic reaction to force and circumstance. That was the final result in India of the age-long pressure of Buddhism and its supplanter and successor, illusionism. No society wholly or too persistently and pervadingly dominated by this denial of the life dynamism can flourish and put forth its possibilities of growth and perfection. For from dynamic, it becomes static, and from the static position, it proceeds to stagnation and degeneration. Even the higher being of man, which finds its account in a vigorous life dynamism, both as a fund of force to be transmuted into its own loftier energies, and as a potent channel of connection with the outer life, suffers in the end by this failure and contraction. The ancient Indian ideal recognized this truth and divided life into four essential and indispensable divisions: artha, kama, dharma, moksha. Vital interests, satisfactions of desires of all kinds, ethics and religion, and liberation or spirituality, and it insisted on the practice and development of all. Still, it tended not only to put the last forward as the goal of all the rest, which it is, but to put it at the end of life, and its habitat in another world of our being, rather than here in life as a supreme status and formative power on the physical plane. But this rules out the idea of the kingdom of God on earth, the perfectibility of society and of man in society, the evolution of a new and diviner race, and without one or other of these, no universal ideal can be complete. It provides a temporary and occasional, but not an inherent justification for life. It holds out no illumining fulfillment, either for its individual or its collective impulse. Let us then look at this vital instinct and life dynamism in its own being, and not merely as an occasion for ethical or religious development, and see whether it is really rebellious in its very nature to the divine. We can see at once that what we have described is the first stage of the vital being, the infrarational, the instinctive. This is the crude character of its first native development, and persists even when it is trained by the growing application to it of the enlightening reason. Evidently, it is in this natural form a thing of the earth, gross, earthy, full even of hideous uglinesses, and brute blunders, and jarring discords, but so also is the infrarational stage in ethics, in aesthetics, in religion. It is true, too, that it presents a much more enormous difficulty than these others, more fundamentally and obstinately resists elevation, because it is the very province of the infrarational, a first formulation of consciousness out of the inconscient, nearest to it in the scale of being. But still it has too, properly looked at, its rich elements of power, beauty, nobility, good, sacrifice, worship, divinity. Here, too, are high-reaching gods, masked but still resplendent. Until recently, and even now, reason, in the garb no longer of philosophy but of science, has increasingly proposed to take up all this physical and vital life and perfect it by the sole power of rationalism, by a knowledge of the laws of nature, of sociology and physiology and biology and health, by collectivism, by state education, by a new psychological education, and a number of other kindred means. All this is well in its own way and in its limits, but it is not enough, and can never come to a truly satisfying success. The ancient attempt of reason, in the form of a high, idealistic, rational, aesthetic, ethical, and religious culture, achieved only an imperfect discipline of the vital man and his instincts, sometimes only a polishing, a gloss, a clothing and mannerizing of the original uncouth savage. The modern attempt of reason, in the form of a broad and thorough, rational, utilitarian, and efficient instruction and organization of man and his life, is not succeeding any better, for all its insistent but always illusory promise of more perfect results in the future. These endeavors cannot indeed be truly successful if our theory of life is right. And if this great mass of vital energism contains in itself the imprisoned suprarational, if it has, as it then must have, the instinctive reaching out for something divine, absolute, and infinite, which is concealed in its blind strivings. Here, too, reason must be overpassed, or surpass itself, and become a passage to the divine. The first mark of the suprarational, when it intervenes to take up any portion of our being, is the growth of absolute ideals. And since life is being and force, and the divine state of being is unity, and the divine in force is God as power taking possession, the absolute vital ideals must be of that nature. Nowhere are they wanting. If we take the domestic and social life of man, we find hints of them there in several forms. But we need only note, however imperfect and dim the present shapes, the strivings of love at its own self-finding, its reaching towards its absolute, the absolute love of man and woman, the absolute maternal or paternal, filial or fraternal love, the love of friends, the love of comrades, love of country, love of humanity. These ideals, of which the poets have sung so persistently, are not a mere glamour and illusion. However the egoisms and discords of our instinctive, infrarational way of living may seem to contradict them, always crossed by imperfection or opposite vital movements, they are still divine possibilities, and can be made a first means of our growth into a spiritual unity of being with being. Certain religious disciplines have understood this truth, have taken up these relations boldly, and applied them to our soul's communion with God, and by a converse process they can, lifted out of their present social and physical formulas, become for us not the poor earthly things they are now, but deep and beautiful and wonderful movements of God in man, fulfilling himself in life. All the economic development of life itself takes on, at its end, the appearance of an attempt to get rid of the animal squalor and bareness, which is what obligatory poverty really means, and to give to man the divine ease and leisure of the gods. It is pursued in a wrong way, no doubt, and with many ugly circumstances. But still the ideal is darkly there. Politics itself, that apparent game of strife and deceit and charlatanism, can be a large field of absolute idealisms. What of patriotism? Never mind the often ugly instincts from which it starts, and which it still obstinately preserves, but in its aspects of worship, self-giving, discipline, self-sacrifice. the great political ideals of man, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, apart from the selfishnesses they serve and the rational and practical justifications with which they arm themselves, have had for their soul an ideal. Some have seen truth of the absolute, and have carried with them a worship, a loyalty, a loss of self in the idea which have made men ready to suffer and die for them. War and strife themselves have been schools of heroism. They have preserved the heroic in man. They have created the kshatriyas of the Sanskrit epic phrase, the men of power and courage who have abandoned their bodily life for a cause. For without heroism, man cannot grow into the Godhead. Courage, energy, and strength are among the very first principles of the divine nature in action. All this great, vital, political, economic life of man, with its two powers of competition and cooperation, is stumbling blindly forward towards some realization of power and unity. In two divine directions, therefore. For the divine in life is power possessed of self-mastery, but also of mastery of his world, and man, and mankind too, move towards conquest of their world, their environment. And again, the divine in fulfillment here is and must be oneness. And the ideal of human unity, however dim and far off, is coming slowly into sight. The competitive nation units are feeling, at times, however feebly as yet, the call to cast themselves into a greater unified cooperative life of the human race.